Hello everyone, and welcome to this month's synth tutorial with computer music. And in this month's edition, we're going to be working with our ZebraCM plugin to create a really wonderful modulating synth pad, which is the kind of sound you would hear used by artists such as Aphex Twin, although this is a sort of sound that would fit in very well with all sorts of contemporary production. So let's begin by opening a copy of your usual and preferred DAW and load in an instance of the ZebraCM plugin on a spare instrument channel. Our first step is our usual step, which is to do an initialize. And to do this, once we've opened the plugin, you go to the menu and display, which is at the top of the plugin, click and come down to where it says Init for initialized. We'll begin the creation of our sound using Oscillator 1, which you'll find over on the left-hand side. Beginning by selecting the waveform, we're going to take the mouse and click and hold in the center of the waveform icon on display and change it until the upper display reads 3.20. Just as a reminder, every time you make an alteration to one of the settings or pots on the ZebraCM plugin, you'll see the value displayed in the upper display at the top here. So always keep an eye on that to get the absolute best settings. Having changed the waveform, we're now going to change the volume to a value of 88. Moving next door to oscillator number 2, we're going to be using a sawtooth, which is the default that we already have on this oscillator. However, we do need to turn the volume up, and we're going to set oscillator 2 volume to a value of 77. Having selected the waveforms for our oscillators, we're now going to move to the filter section. Now, as many of you will know, the ZebraCM plugin is equipped with a whole feast of different filter types. However, we think that the LP 12dB filter is a good choice for this particular sound. But do feel free to try some of the other filter types. You never know, there might be a sound in there that you prefer. Having selected the low-pass 12dB filter, we're now going to change the cutoff amount to a value of 76. The sound we're creating is going to be relatively dull, and consequently we need to reduce the cutoff by quite a sizable amount. To supply a little bit of bite at the front end of every sound, we're going to use envelope 2 to modulate the cutoff frequency. We can see that we have a user-defined pot which is already set up for this purpose in mind, so we're going to change the value on this pot to a value of 11. At this point, we should be hearing a sound that sounds like this. Next, we're going to start working with the LFO. Now, the LFO is the bit that's going to give us the slightly woozy nature of this sound. LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, and in essence, it's an oscillator which is basically creating a cycle at a very slow rate. Consequently, we can't hear it, but we can hear it when it modulates another signal. We need to ensure that we're working with low frequency oscillator number 1 at this particular stage, so ensure that you have the icon with a 1 in the middle of it so it's glowing in turquoise. We then move slightly to the left to the LFO section and to the rate pot, and we're going to set our rate to a value of 46. Now this is relatively slow, but we will start to hear the effect that this has on the pitch of the other oscillators momentarily. Moving back to oscillator number 1, we need to dictate the amount of modulation of the pitch of oscillator 1 using the pot that's labelled vibrato with LFO1 written underneath it. Click and hold on that pot and set it to a value of 30. We're going to do a similar thing with oscillator number 2, but actually we're going to apply an even greater amount of modulation, so set the value of this one to a value of 79. And while we're in the vicinity of the oscillators again, we're going to do some subtle detuning. So on oscillator 1, detune that by a value of -5, and on oscillator number 2, detune it by a value of +5. We should now start to hear the shape of our woozy sound. You can hear that's modulating quite nicely now. So next we're going to look at our envelope section. We're going to begin with envelope number 1, which is controlling the amplitude or volume of our sound. We've got some alterations to make to the attack, decay and release pots. So starting with the attack pot, change that to a value of 16. Then the decay pot, we're going to change to a value of 45. And then finally the release pot, we're going to set to a value of 23. We're now going to make some adjustments to envelope 2, and as a reminder, envelope number 2 is heading in the direction of the filter. We need to change the attack, decay, sustain and release for this particular setting, so starting with the attack phase, change that to a value of 50. Moving to the decay phase, set a value of 56. we're going to lower the sustain phase to a value of 35, and then finally the release phase was set to a value of 24. And that pretty much creates our sound, at least in terms of the programming we need to do on the Zebra CM. We should now have a sound like this. And as you can hear, it sounds very, very eerie, but I think we can go a little bit further to create the sound that we're after. It's worth utilising a little bit of EQ on this sound, and you can see I've already got an EQ setting in place, which rolls off a lot of the bottom end. You can see from roughly just above the 500 Hz point, I'm rolling off that bottom end to just get rid of all that bottom end content that we don't need. If I switch the EQ off, you can hear it sounds very rich in the bottom end. Far too rich for production terms in terms of what we want to do. So by reinstating the EQ, we just roll off the bottom end, and it means it'll slot into the mix better. The final element of this sound is really related to reverb and delay. And actually, if we use a really merciless reverb, we're using the black hole reverb here from Eventide, you can hear if I switch it off, it sounds very dry. If I switch it in, it's very long indeed, and actually it's the kind of sound that's going to add to the eerie nature. Now you can use any reverb that you may have to hand, preferably one that will create a relatively long reverb tail, but it's important to stress that if you keep the long reverb tail, keep the mix low, so the actual tail of the reverb will be there, but it won't hopefully get in the way of your production. If you want to extend it even further, you could also apply a tape delay. You can see we're just using the tape delay from within Logic here, and we're just using a relatively generous feedback and a little bit of wetness on the back end there, just to elongate the reverb tail even further. And being a tape delay, it will add a little bit of colour as well. So that's our modulated pad sound for this month. We'll see you next time.